There's a moment in Monster Hunter Wilds that feels small on the surface, almost like a gentle character beat meant to give you a break between hunts. You're walking with Nata through a place that shouldn't exist, a living culture in a land the old world called empty. And you notice the way his people move, the way they listen before they step, the way their tools are built more for signaling than for killing, the way their village is arranged like it expects the land to change moods without warning. None of it screams lore bomb. But if you sit with it, really sit with it, that little moment becomes one of the loudest questions in the whole game. Because the Keepers aren't like any other human group we've met in Monster Hunter, not the Caravaneers, not the Wyverians, not seaside outposts who trade fish for potions. The Keepers live inside the most dangerous legacy zone on the planet. At a continent still pulsing with ancient bioenergy, still haunted by artificial guardians, still ruled by weather cycles that can turn a calm valley into a war zone in minutes. And yet they don't carry weapons. They don't hunt the way the guild hunts. They don't even talk about monsters in the same grammar we do. In a world where survival has always been tied to hunting, that's either insanity or evidence of a history the guild doesn't understand. So tonight, that's our puzzle. Why are the Keepers a culture without weapons, and what does that reveal about the Forbidden Land's true past? What kind of catastrophe teaches a people that steel and strength are not the solution? And why does their way of life look less like primitive survival and more like hard-won design? Because if Arkveld in Episode 2 was the Forbidden Land's immune system gone feral, then the Keepers are the only humans who have survived long enough to remember what the immune system was built for. Before we go deeper, same quick, sincere note as always. If you're enjoying this series and you want the next episodes to keep landing fast and in full length, a like and a subscribe helps more than you'd think. It tells YouTube that this kind of long-form Monster Hunter lore is worth showing to other hunters who love the world as much as we do. And please drop a comment with what other games or series you'd want in this style after we finish Wilds. I'm lining up future arcs, and your suggestions genuinely shape what gets made. Thanks for being here. Let's keep going. Now, back to the Keepers. The Guild's worldview is straightforward. Humans survive by mastering the hunt. Monsters are natural forces that become dangerous when balance tilts. Hunters are a regulated tool to restore that balance. Every village in the old world leans on that structure. Even when they fear monsters, they trust the idea that a trained hunter, armed with the right weapon and knowledge, can deal with what's out there. The Keepers don't share that faith. They don't build their lives around killing monsters. They build their lives around not provoking them, not being noticed by them, and not disrupting the rhythms that keep them alive. That alone is a hint that the threats they live beside aren't the kind the Guild was built to handle. But the deeper hint is in the way they interact with the ecosystem, especially through sound. If you watch Keeper practices closely, you see a pattern that is almost the inverse of the Guild's approach. Hunters use weapons to impose an outcome onto the landscape. The Keepers use chimes to negotiate outcomes with the landscape. Their chimes aren't random ornaments. They're tuned, deliberate, tied to migration paths. They mimic apex calls. They carry signals that herd animals respond to and apex predators respect or ignore depending on the phase. Sometimes they draw creatures away from places that would become unsafe. Sometimes they steer herds toward shelter. And sometimes, in moments of tension, you can feel the chimes acting like a soft boundary line the ecosystem recognizes. This is not superstition. It's a survival technology built out of sound. And here's the first critical implication. You can't survive like this unless your land follows recognizable patterns. A person can't herd a storm. A village can't time its harvests around random chaos. A culture can't base safety on signaling unless the predators they signal to have stable behavioral rules. The Keepers are living proof that even in the Forbidden Land's damaged state, the system is predictable enough for someone who has studied it for generations. That predictability doesn't feel natural in Wilds because you, as a hunter, are used to reacting to monsters, not anticipating a continent's mood, but the Keepers do anticipate it. Their architecture is low, flexible, arranged to retreat and reform as phases shift. Their paths aren't direct, they're layered like contingency routes. Their daily routines feel like a dance with timing you don't yet hear. So the second implication lands right behind the first. The Keepers didn't figure this out recently. Their culture is built for a machine world from the ground up. They didn't adapt to random wilderness. They adapted to an engineered cycle. All of this would already make them fascinating, but it becomes combustible once you remember what Episode 1 showed us. The Forbidden Lands are not simply wild. They're the remains of Wyveria's energy empire. The landspine still pulses. The Evertorch still leaks. Guardian constructs still roam. The climate still rotates through states that are effectively the afterimage of Wyverian regulation. The Keepers are not a separate storyline from that history. They are a continuation of it. They are the human species that stayed behind when Wyveria fell. Wilds makes that clear in late narrative beats, but you don't need the explicit confirmation to feel it. The Keeper's very existence solves a riddle that Monster Hunter has dangled for years. What happened to the people who lived among the ancient ruins? We've always found their towers and their weapons and their murals, but never their descendants. Wilds finally gives us a living culture that fits into that empty slot. But if they are descendants of Wyveria, why do they reject Wyveria's defining trait, technology used to tame nature? That question is the heart of Episode 3. To answer it, we need to rewind to a moment in Keeper history that Wilds doesn't show as a cutscene, but shows through consequences. Wyveria built the Evertorch. Wyveria built guardian monsters. Wyveria wired its continent together like a living engine. And then something went wrong so catastrophically that the Empire collapsed, the landspine fractured, and the Guardians became feral. The Keepers survived that collapse, but surviving a collapse like that doesn't just leave rubble, it leaves memory. Imagine what a child's bedtime story would sound like for a people who watched artificial dragons tear their world apart. Imagine what a village elder would teach in a land where the brightest, most advanced society in history died because it convinced itself that bioenergy was a leash, not a storm. Imagine the cultural scar that forms when a civilization's tools become its predators. You don't come out of that history thinking, we should rebuild the old ways. You come out thinking, the old ways nearly erased us. So the Keeper's weaponlessness begins to read not as weakness, but as a vow that says, we will never be Wyveria again. That might sound dramatic, but Monster Hunter's world is a place where cultural survival is built on extreme lessons. The Guild itself is an institution founded on a lesson like that. Don't repeat the ancient civilization's overreach. Don't weaponize dragons. Don't hoard energy beyond what ecosystems can bear. The Guild's philosophy is essentially a sanitized, bureaucratic version of Wyveria's fall. The Keepers are the raw version. They didn't write a charter, they wrote a way of life. So that gives us our first big evidence thread for tonight. The Keepers reject weapons because their ancestral memory ties weaponized control of monsters to civilization collapse. For them, hunting isn't a noble duty. It's the first step down a road they've already seen end in fire. Now, let's test that thread against what we see in the game, because a theory has to fit the lived details. Notice how Keepers relate to dominance. When a new apex rises in a biome, the Guild's instinct is to confront it and restore balance by force. The Keeper's instinct is to adapt their behavior to it, then wait for the phase cycles to shift the hierarchy naturally, or for the land's deeper systems to correct it. They aren't passive, they're strategic, but their strategy assumes something the Guild doesn't fully internalize yet. That some apex rises are not errors, but functions of the land's pulse. This matches what we know now about Arkfeld. Arkfeld was a failsafe for apex overload. When Arkfeld hunts the top predator, the Keepers don't read that solely as an intrusion. They read it as the land's old systems firing. They fear it, yes. Anyone would fear a rogue failsafe. But they understand the category, even when they don't understand the exact cause. The Guild is trying to interpret Arkfeld in the language of wildlife management. The Keepers interpret Arkfeld in the language of legacy technology. That difference is the second big evidence thread. The Keepers' survival strategy is built on an inherited understanding that the land is an engineered system with engineered threats. They don't fight the machine, they live around it. Now, notice something else. Keepers don't just avoid weapons, they also avoid the kinds of energy dependence that defined Wyveria. This isn't spelled out in a lecture, but it shows up in the way their settlements function. They don't plug into the land spine. They don't harvest Wilk as a fuel source the way Wyveria did. Their tools are low impact. Their rituals focus on alignment with phase cycles rather than on forcing phase outcomes. They are living off the grid in the most literal possible sense. And that's not because they're incapable of higher technology. It's because they have inherited a cultural allergy to it. For them, Wilk isn't a blessing. It's a reminder of the dragon torch, the thing that powered their ancestors, and then fed the thing that destroyed them. This becomes especially clear in their relationship with Wyveria's ruins. They don't treat the ruins like treasure. They treat them like hazardous memory. There's reverence, yes, but it's not celebratory. It's cautious. The ruins are not our glorious past. They are our warning. That gives us a third evidence thread. The Keeper's entire cultural framework is a containment strategy for the seduction of Wyverian power. They deliberately live smaller than what they could be because they know where bigger leads. So far, these threads sit neatly together. But there's still a sharper question hiding inside them. How did they maintain this memory for 2,000 years without becoming the guild? Why didn't they formalize into an institution of hunters and researchers the way the old world did? The answer is in geography, isolation, and trauma. The old world inherited ruins, but not direct witnesses. It pieced together the ancient catastrophe from scattered relics. Over time, that piecing hardened into moral philosophy and then into regulation. The Guild is an attempt to turn an old tragedy into a manageable system. Set rules, train hunters, ration hunts, prevent overreach. The Keepers weren't piecing together anything. They were living with the direct consequences every day. The land spines still throbbed under their feet. The phase cycles still threatened their crops. Guardian monsters still prowled the deep. Their trauma wasn't archaeological. It was ecological and immediate. In that reality, you don't build a formal hunting class. You build a people of listeners, a people who read the land so carefully that they don't need to throw spears at it. The Keeper's talent is not fighting, it's prediction, it's timing, it's the kind of ecological literacy that makes hunting a last resort instead of a standard tool. And this is where we get to a key pivot in the episode. The Keepers are not anti-hunter, they are post-hunter. They've already seen what hunting becomes when fused with limitless energy and artificial ecology. So they choose a different relationship with strength. That framing is important because it stops this from becoming a shallow, noble pacifists versus aggressive hunters story. The Keepers aren't morally superior by default. They are strategically adapted to the specific kind of world they inherited. Their restraint is pragmatic, not romantic. Now, let's bring Nata fully into this, because Nata is the doorway for the player into Keeper psychology. Nata is young, but he already carries the Keeper worldview like breath. When he sees a monster, he doesn't talk about it like a target. He talks about it like a force. When he sees you prepping to hunt, he watches the way one might watch someone start a fire near a gas leak. Not because fire is evil, but because he's unsure you understand the environment you're striking in. This becomes emotional after the White Wraith attacks his village. Nata doesn't ask you to help for revenge. He asks you to help because Arkveld is a failure of the old system, and the Keepers are caught between it and the natural apexes it destabilizes. He wants safety, not conquest. That makes him a perfect microcosm of his people's philosophy. He is not afraid of strength, he is afraid of misplaced strength, which is, maybe, the most monster hunter thing any character has ever embodied. Because if you look at the series across decades, the real villain has never been monsters. It's been imbalance, it's been hubris, it's been misunderstanding a world so vast that you think you can rule it. Nata, and by extension the Keepers, are a cultural, immune response to hubris. Now, we need to connect this Keeper philosophy to the broader lore mystery of Wilds, and that means returning to the question Episode 2 ended on: if Arkveld is a failsafe that trims apex dominance, what overload was Wyveria originally afraid of? The Keepers are the living clue. The existence of a failsafe implies a recurring threat. Not a one-time accident, but a pattern Wyveria expected to face again and again. If that threat were purely natural, Wyveria could have relied on ordinary apex hierarchies to correct it. You don't build artificial monster armies and continent-wide energy hearts for ordinary nature. You build them for something nature can't contain. So what was it? Wilds points us towards the simplest and most chilling answer: bioenergy addiction at civilization scale. Wyveria built the dragon torch. It distributed infinite energy into the land. It fed its constructs, including Arkveld, on that energy. But energy like that changes ecosystems whether you want it to or not. It creates hot zones. It accelerates evolution. It produces apex arms races. It may even attract elder class presences that can sense the pulse. In that world, the greatest threat isn't an individual monster, it's the feedback loop between energy pulses and predator dominance. A spiral where energy surges produce more powerful apexes. More powerful apexes hoard or distort the energy. The distortion forces harsher surges, and the cycle intensifies until something breaks. Arkveld's role as a regulator makes sense only if Wyveria feared that spiral becoming unstoppable. But Wyveria didn't just fear it. Wyveria fed it. Every time it pushed the dragon torch harder, it likely sharpened the spiral. The Empire was balancing on a knife it kept making thinner. And eventually, the knife snapped. Xochitl, fueled directly by dragon torch energy, grew beyond control and turned on its creators. In a sense, Xochitl is what happens when the feedback loop reaches its final node. A guardian built to protect the system becomes the system's largest destabilizer. Arkveld was built to prevent a Xochitl-scale escalation from happening again, to cut down apexes before they could become the next runaway node. The Keepers saw that happen. That's why they reject weapons. Because to them, weapons aren't neutral tools. Weapons are the enabling step that makes an energy spiral possible. The moment you normalize domination by force, you open the door to the old catastrophe. So the reveal of episode 3 becomes this. The Keepers are what Wyveria would have become if it had learned restraint before the Dragon Torch War. They are the surviving branch that took Wyveria's lesson at human scale instead of institutional scale. Instead of building a guild, they built a culture of ecological listening. Instead of wielding weapons, they wielded timing. Instead of harvesting infinite energy, they learned to live with the pulses without needing to own them. Now, let's explore the aftershock this has for the entire Monster Hunter universe. Because once you understand the Keepers this way, the Guild looks different too. The Guild likes to present itself as the world's stabilizing conscience. Hunters are the good guys who manage dangerous wildlife so villages can survive. And to be clear, in practice, that's often true. The old world would be ash without hunters. But the Keepers force us to confront a more uncomfortable layer. The Guild is a compromise with the same instinct Wyveria had. The instinct to solve nature with force. The Guild restrains that instinct through regulation. Yes, it tries to keep hunters from becoming conquerors. It tries to limit the spiral by controlling who can hunt what and when. But at the end of the day, it still believes that equilibrium is maintained by trained violence. The Keepers believe equilibrium is maintained by trained humility. Neither approach is purely right in every circumstance. The old world has different pressures. It doesn't live atop a damaged energy heart. It doesn't see guardian constructs wandering in the deep. It needs hunters to survive threats that can't be negotiated with. But Wilds is quietly asking whether hunters, even regulated ones, are enough to handle a machine world legacy. Because in a system like the Forbidden Lands, violence can trigger ancient failsafes. Killing an apex can open a vacuum, the land spine floods with energy. Overhunting could accelerate the feedback loop Arkveld was built to suppress. A blunt solution can call down a sharper disaster. This is why the Guild's mission in Wilds feels so tense. It's not just go hunt the big monster, it's learn a land whose rules were written by ghosts. The Keepers are the only living people who already know those rules, which means the Guild, for the first time in the series, is not the primary teacher. It is the student. And that shift is huge, because it suggests a possible future for Monster Hunter's world. Maybe survival can eventually become something other than endless hunting. Maybe the world isn't locked into Wyveria's cycle forever. Maybe the Keepers represent a third path. Not domination, not surrender, but fluent coexistence. Wilds doesn't preach this as a moral, but it structures the story around it. Your success depends not only on your weapon skill, but on learning to read phases, to respect migration pulses, to understand why certain beasts rise during inclemency, and why the land sometimes wants you to step aside. In other words, Wilds is trying to teach hunters to think more like Keepers. Now, there's still a fair counter-reading here, and we should give it room before we close. Someone could argue the Keepers don't use weapons because they're simply not capable of making them in an isolated land. Maybe their chimes are spiritual quirks. Maybe they are a small culture surviving by hiding, not by wisdom. Maybe their restraint is just necessity dressed as virtue. That counter-reading collapses as soon as you look at the sophistication of their practices and their survival scale. A helpless culture doesn't last 2,000 years inside a machine world full of apexes and constructs. A helpless culture doesn't develop tuned apex mimicry chimes. A helpless culture doesn't maintain calm coordination of herds through phase storms. These are adaptations that require deep, cross-generational ecological science, even if it's carried orally instead of written in Wyverian script. So while the keepers may also be limited by resources, their weaponlessness is not a lack. It's a choice they have turned into a philosophy. Which brings us to the bridge for episode 4. If the keepers are descendants of Wyveria who chose humility over control, then they are carrying the purest surviving memory of Wyveria's fall. And if they built chime-based survival as a response to phase cycles, they may also know something the guild still doesn't. What the Landspine is trying to do right now. Because keep this in mind, the Forbidden Lands machine world is damaged, but it's not dead. The phases are getting harsher, apex ladders are accelerating, Arkveld has awakened, and somewhere deeper in the grid, the ancient doomsday logic that created Xo'Shia is still wired into the system.